Mandela comes to Leah. No, he said, freedom is never conditioned, and shackles clamped on the veteran of Robben Island. No, she said, knowledge permits no exclusion. Scarred but unscared, the face of the maid of Pakistan. No, she said, faith is not on compulsion. A captive voice, demure but defiant in Dapchi, her torch undimmed in the den of zealots. Thus, across time, testamentary voice recurrent, Mandela, Malala, Leah Sharibu, the torch of no set Prometheus, flame and anthem, finds fissures, lustrous flame bursts through Chibok and Dapchi to re-illuminate the world.
Mandela wá sí ọ̀dọ̀ Leah, wọlé Soyinka àti Kola Tubosun. Rárá, òun wí, a kì í sokùn mọ́mìnira lọ́wọ́. Ṣẹ́kẹ́ṣẹkẹ̀ sì pàdé mọ́ ẹlẹ́wọ̀n àgbà Robben Island lẹ́sẹ̀. Bẹ́ẹ̀ kọ́, òun sọ, ìmọ̀ kì í yọ ẹnìkan sẹ́yìn. Pẹ̀lú àpá, ṣùgbọ́n láì bẹ̀rù, ẹ wo ojú omidan Pakistani yẹn. Rárá, òun ní, ìgbàgbọ́ kì í ṣe tipátipá. Ohun àhámọ́ tútù ṣùgbọ́n onígboyà ní Dapchi. Ìmọ́lẹ̀ ẹ̀ kò ṣeé pa nínú ihò àwọn alákatakítí ẹ̀sìn. Bẹ́ẹ̀ ni látinú ìgbà wá, ohun ìjẹ́rìísí tó ń padà wá, Mandela, Malala, Leah Sharibu, àtùpà tó ní rárá ni Prometheus wí. Ìmọ́lẹ̀ àti orin ń rí àyè ìtúpalẹ̀. Iná yoyo kan ń bú jáde, Chibok àti Dapchi, láti tún mú ilé ayé mọ́lẹ̀ sí i.
What are your sources of inspiration? What are your influences, etc.? So I find it very difficult to answer, but definitely my contact with Fagunwa School Bujuode as a child is one of the earliest works I read across Yoruba, and it made a great impact on me. First of all, the verb of the storytelling, the sheer joy of narrating, which is in there. And that's why I say I enter into the mind of the writer when I'm translating. Just the law of language resonated with me on so many levels. And when I sort of grew more and more into writing, decided to do literature as an English literature, my mind never left the Yoruba works in which I was brought up. Whether I'm talking about the Jala, the poetry, the proverbs, the richness of discourse, the sheer rhetorical flair, the tonality of the Yoruba language, in contrast, for instance, to English, which is our colonial languages. So I made up my mind at a certain stage, when I was studying literature, that I was going to translate all of Fagunwa's works. Well, that was some ambition. After Bujuode, I said, thank you, I think I better concentrate a bit on my own. Otherwise, I'll never get to it, because that was a headache. And it was my first experience in translating a full work. Occasional poetry, yes, but not a novel.
Yeah. But you did eventually go back to translate Igbo Olodumare.
Yeah, that's true. And what happened, what caused that, I'm not very sure. It wasn't somebody through a challenge, but, well, indirect challenge. I think somebody mentioned that, everybody's neglecting Fagunwa. And certainly since you translated this, we haven't seen any other translation, which is not absolutely true, actually, because in Senegal, I think it was it Ivory Coast, somebody translated my Bujuode into French, and from there moved to translate other words. So that wasn't strictly true. But I did agree with him that it was a pity that Fagunwa's other works were being neglected. And I think one day I just sat down and said, let me take another look at another of his works and see whether in the meantime I've become more courageous with my own writing and so on. I think that's what happened.
Yeah. But at the time you did the first one, again you were 34. What was the public what was public reaction? Because then you had become a writer of your own. At the time you had published some of the plays. How did the people accept that English translation?
I think there was enthusiasm and also a sense of this was always there, and why wasn't this done before? I think the reaction was very positive, and even ordinary non-scholars, non-literary scholars who happened on it, they mentioned how delighted they were.
Yeah. For some reason, people remember the first one more than the second one, perhaps because of the spacing between them. But in your own estimation of the challenges it took to write the first one, to translate the first one and translate the second one, what would you say what was the difference in how you...
Well, let me tell you frankly why I think people remember the first one. First of all, it was the first, okay? And it was a school text. So many of us grew up with it, got attached to it. But being as objective as possible, Obujuode, for me, remains his best work. In the other, he's a moralist, Fagunwa. And gradually, as he progressed, his moralizing began to encroach on just the sheer storytelling joy. And as he grew older, he found more to comment on human nature directly, more to pontificate on human conduct. And I think he began to mature more as a moralist, utilizing the medium of fiction than a fiction writer, throwing in, building fiction around some morality. I think that's what happened. And maybe that's why his other works didn't get as the kind of translation which they deserved.
Okay.
Because he didn't lose the sense of storytelling, no.
Yeah.
It's just that one thing became more preponderant.
Yeah. And the good thing about what you did at the time, which was quite visionary, I think, is that you introduced Fagunwa to the rest of the world in a way that was not the way before, because he was writing for Yoruba audience and only Yoruba people could access him, but through your work he was able to transcend into those spaces. If I may ask, what do you think has happened to the Yoruba writing industry that has prevented us from having more Fagunwas today?
I think it's part of the colonial pressure. What language do we use? Even when there is a coup, the most illiterate soldier who comes to announce, it's not always a coup maker who uses the English language. You have to sometimes listen very carefully to see what are they promising or threatening this time.
Yeah.
So there is that. English has become, whether Pidgin English or Queen's English or whatever you call it, it's become part and parcel of our lives. And the younger generation, if you like, you could say that we are responsible also for not deliberately, but misdirecting them, because as we got notoriety from writing, and they also wanted to be writers, so they gravitated more towards the writing. Yeah. In vain do I sometimes, as I do sometimes, tell them that, look, even when I write my plays, very often I think in Yoruba, and so they shouldn't let me mislead them too much. One of my favorite sayings by fellow writers was that of Akinshola, when he translated Death and the King's Horseman.
Okay.
And he was asked, didn't you find it difficult to translate? Soyinka's English is always rather tortuous and so on. He said, not in the least. He said, what I did was translate back into Yoruba the play which he wrote in English but thought in Yoruba, which I thought also corresponded to my own approach to
We call it
literature.
retrieval.
Yes, that was real literary retrieval. Beautiful translation. So I think it is that we, and internet language is English. So English, unfortunately, has become so pervasive. It's become the language, whether we like it or not, of creativity.
But there is the irony that Fagunwa, who published in the 50s, when the British ran the publishing industry mostly, had the, I wouldn't say courage, but at the time it was just not a thing of, he didn't feel like it was rebellion. He was just writing because that was the language in which he thought and he could express himself. The irony that after the British left and the publishing industry fell into the hands of Nigerians was when the publishing in local language also went down. I find it quite interesting.
Well, don't forget also that literature at that time was even in Yoruba was turned into a colonial weapon. You know, if you remember that we had pamphlets in Yoruba, in Igbo, and so on, and the missionaries realizing that they could get at the soul of their captives, so they didn't mind encouraging works like Fagunwa's, especially if it had a bit of morality. If you read Fagunwa, sort of deeply, you'll find echoes of John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, possibly touches of Dante here and there, but not all that deeply. So, just like songs, music, the missionaries, when they wanted to get at the Yorubas, found that if they presented them with hymns, Christian hymns, but attuned to Yoruba melodies, that they get more covered. So this is somehow even how our language survived, ironically, through those who wanted to suppress the culture, the beliefs, the worldview, the etc., etc. But they realized that language was also a very powerful tool, and they didn't mind, as long as the souls came.
So if Fagunwa had been subversive in his Yoruba work, you think he might have got some resistance or some pushback? If Yoruba literature at the time was subversive, they wouldn't have encouraged it as much.
Well, if we had been more conscious, if our, let's say, our forebears had been more conscious of the threat to Yoruba language, there would have been more literature. But if we're using Yoruba, and one or two writers are coming on, pamphleteering, Azigdela, and all the others. There were even stories, novels. I've discovered some novels which had not been published at the time, and full Yoruba novels which exist. What's the title of the last one I encountered? Not I discovered it, no. I think Abeni, the story of Abeni. I don't know if you're on into it. It's a full novel, and it's actually a very fascinating novel. Yes.
There was one I know about, written by I.B. Thomas. I think it's titled, I can't remember now, but it was serialized in the newspapers at the time and then made into a novel. So there were, batches of people writing in different ways at the time, but not as consciously as trying.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, I want to go into your own background as a writer. I know you've mentioned in the past, please correct me if I'm wrong, that your first books you read were in Yoruba, and that you discovered English language writings much later. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, around, we're talking about publications, for instance. There was Iroyin newspapers, I talk of newspapers a bit, and little magazines. Iroyin Yoruba was there. My father used to take it at the time. Then there was another, Akedeko.
Yes.
Akedeko in Yoruba, with even some with cartoons in Yoruba, comics, Tutufioko, the adventures in Yoruba, with all the frames and so on. And so, side by side with all those, you had, of course, the Bible. You had the hymn book. And then you had English publications, at least in my father's library, the small library. I came across Greek mythology for the first time, and I was struck by certain similarities between the Greek drama and Fagunwa's novels, certain characters and so on. And straight away, I think I grew up within what I call a comparative literature sensibility. I'm sure if that had been Hausa or Igbo or Shekiri literature, I would also have learned to read all those languages. But they were just the Yoruba and the English. And that, I developed this sensibility of seeing literature as a seamless continuity across the two cultures which I knew at the time.
Thank you. Let's see. So when you were growing up, what Yoruba poetry, you mentioned Ijala earlier, and I know because of your history as a hunter as well, Ijala must, I think, appeal to you more than any other ones. But do you have any other Yoruba poetry mediums that...
Well, there's Ewi, as you know very well, and I can't quite remember a few others. But what I want us to remember also is that radio came into our lives quite early, and Yoruba programs,
Yes.
especially the poetry,
Yes.
came on. So we had satirical poetry also,
Yes,
political
yes.
poetry,
Yeah.
you know, coming on the radio, social criticism, satire of the nouveau riche, the wannabe whites, and so on. So the whole crisscross, become a mishmash of literary concourse was going on at the time all around us, and we were responding to it.
Yeah. Okay. I want to take you back a little bit to the your translation of Fagunwa's work. I remember in the process you coined a few English Shakespeare words so as to deal with ideas in Yoruba literature that white people couldn't understand, like kobold or nom and all of that. What was your internal deliberation about, how to go about that, and how do you think it crossed over to the audience?
Translation is, the levels of translation, I think, are far more numerous than, many people think. Take a tonal language like which the Yoruba is. The tonality is so critical, so crucial. And that's why the Yoruba turn out to be some of the greatest rhetoricians, because of the way they have to use their voices to capture the nuances of Yoruba phraseologies, etc., and the proverbs and so on. So there was this most forbidding aspect. How do you translate a tone into syllabic, rendition? Some of these words just didn't exist in English, I remember my father's dictionary. It was just that thing, small Oxford dictionary. And of course, you graduated that. The bigger all the standard English dictionaries came, ironically, the more they neglected the equivalents, which is in my own language. So it became instinct at how do I capture what Fagunwa has just said? And so I retranslated it into English. It's a not all that complicated process, but you felt you wanted to make sure you were not betraying Fagunwa, that you were not betraying the Yoruba language. And so, and of course, by then you realize that the language is not static in any society. And so let me have my own. That was the attitude.
Yeah.
So I listened and tried to capture the equivalent in English.
Yeah.
That's all.
By the way, what you mentioned earlier about the problems and sometimes the shortcuts some people take, especially at the beginning of writing in Yoruba, was what brought issue to become notorious in the English language as Satan and devil, which wasn't the case before the colonialists came. You've had strong thought about that. The way Crowther and his generation used the Bible to impose evil and good on issue, which was in Yoruba a more complex character.
Yeah. Well, this again was part of it, and it affected sometimes the choices made by Yoruba translation into Yoruba. There was, for instance, a time when I think it was when the Abibola translated not the Odu, probably just Ijala, into rhymed couplets. And it was like as if the free translation just wouldn't do, didn't correspond to his notion of poetry, of English poetry. And he was not the only one. There's a temptation to which a number of writers succumbed. And the other beef, which is somewhat related to this, take hymns. Let's go back to hymns, in which the hymns were translated, and I was very conscious of this. I was a chorister for some time while I was say hard religion. All that is gone now. And I would say this tune, betrays the meaning of the Yoruba.
Yeah.
Simply because the tonality, yes, it didn't follow the Yoruba flow. And it is from that one then moved towards the actual meaning. The actual meaning before one comes then to the external, the wholesale external treachery against even the meaning, the significance of Yoruba deities, which is where we began the issue. And that's why, and of course, as a child, when I was young, I also accepted, the English rendition of Ishu as the devil. When I began to study comparative mythology, and I recognized the characteristics of Ishu in other cultures, Scandinavian, not just the English, the Scandinavian, for instance, which was my next port of call in terms of interest. And then you realize the severe damage, the severe insult which had been heaped on our own deities, which means on our religion, which means on our spirituality, our worldview, our sense of phenomena, etc. The damage is enormous. I think that's when I became very combative, and moved on, developed even my own attachment to one of the deities as my own particular demiurge.
Yeah, I'm glad to say that when I worked at Google, I was one of those to help change the Google Translate meaning of issue. It used to say demon and Satan, but I realized when I worked there that I could go back and tell the people in charge of it that this is not the case. People are complaining, and we've changed Satan to satanic, which makes sense, among others.
No, it's the same thing when I translated. I said I'm not using demons. Yes. And I saw, because in college I studied Greek for some time. Yes. I know that daimon is actually not pejorative, and so I translated 1,000 demons. You see, adjustments like that all the way. That's what we all do.
Yeah. Also, in your work, you have used a lot of Yoruba. You mentioned that also, and as a dramatist, I'm sure many of the songs that you had to compose to go with your works were done in Yoruba as well. And you have Alapata Pata, which is a play on the butcher and the slaughterer. Yeah. And I also noticed in some of your works, you have written the Yoruba words appropriately with their tone marking, especially you must have put that done. I was surprised by the consistency with which Yoruba words were written with the appropriate diacritics. Many writers today, even Nigerian writers, of Yoruba descent, do not put that kind of effort into the publishing process. I don't know if it's the writer's fault or the publisher's fault. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It's a combination of that. Sometimes the publisher uses a printer who, is not, he doesn't have that kind of commitment, and so they just leave it. Me, I always ask the publisher, please let us wherever possible. I've also worked with, indirectly, with somebody like Doig Simmons, who used to live here. He was a curator, artistic curator, etc., and a medical illustrator. And he was working on a software for Yoruba with all the marks. And even as yesterday, I corresponded with him, and I have a feeling he's been working on, he said he's up to something. Okay. So I'm waiting to hear from him, and I have a feeling it's a further refinement of this Yoruba orthography.
I hope so. I've also worked in that regard.
I noticed in your writing.
Yes.
But when I write, I'm too lazy to. So I say, let the others do the work.
I think because it's a part of the publishing process, the writer just has to write.
Absolutely.
The process of getting the book to the press, I believe that the publishers have obligations, I think, as well, to ensure that the book reflects what the author wants. I mean, if you don't push back, of course, they are happy to just do it the way they want.
Today, they have no excuse.
Yeah, exactly.
How are they going to publish Alapata Apata,
Exactly.
which is about
Exactly.
correcting tonalities and so on?
Exactly.
They have no choice.
Yeah.
You're right. I think writers really have to push. We have to push them.
Thank you. Happy to hear you say that. So have you ever considered writing in Yoruba?
I have, as a matter of fact. I've written a short story or two in the past, not recently, no. I was fascinated by and encouraged by Kola Tubosun's translation. He translated something recently, and...
of yours? Of yours? Something of yours?
No, not of mine, no. But I think... No, translate an original work.
Oh.
Original work, yes, last year sometime. But I don't know how far it's gone with it now. So more and more people are at least feeling a sense of obligation to the language. And well, it's too late. Don't ask me to come and write or from scratch from Yoruba. No way. First of all, the rhythm. When you write, there's a rhythm to it.
Yes, sure.
Once I start work on that laptop, I don't want any interruption.
Yes. That makes sense. Ake by way, Ake Omishola did that. He translated Ake into Yoruba. Professor Ake Omishola.
Yes.
He also did then at the King's Horseman as Equal Loquency. I think you mentioned some of your work, but has any other work besides that and besides the 501 been translated into any Nigerian or African language?
Some poems, yes. Some poems. I don't remember which ones, but definitely a number of poems that I know.
One of the poems we're working on today is a poem of yours translated into Yoruba by myself. Why did you choose that one? Let me ask.
Well, sometimes you forget that there are certain convenient items to hand. When I was contacted, I offered something in prose. I wasn't sure if they would like it and so on. And then before they even said they accepted it or didn't accept it, I then had a flash. This poem, which in fact was the result of a collaboration between me and my Italian publisher. I'd written the long poem Ode to Chibok, Leah, and we wanted to get it out in pamphlet form in time for World Poetry Day, and decided on a joint compilation of publication in two languages, English and Italian. And he then just said one day, and I wanted some companion poems. Mandela is my poem to Mandela, one of my many poems to Mandela.
You have an album, actually.
Yes, I still have an album which I recorded.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, like everybody else, Mandela has been a fascination, a being of enormous fascination to people like me. Anyway, so I said I wanted the poem to Mandela together with Chibok. And then after he got the two, he said, why don't you write a poem? He said, Italians, many of them, they know Mandela, they don't know Chibok, they haven't been with this. But if you were to write something, sort of introduction between, linking the two, history. So that's what he said. And as I sat down, I felt, why should I worry myself about this Italian? If they haven't heard about Chibok, I mean, this is a disgrace, I don't want their edition. Anyway, as I sat down, then it just occurred to me, I said, well, why don't I bring the two together in a poem rather than in an essay? Yeah. He wanted a kind of essay.
Yeah.
So that's how it came about. And I sat down to it and it came up just like that.
And in the poem you connected not just Mandela and Chibok, but also to Malala.
Malala, yes. There's a whole predicament of the woman in these days of religious fundamentalism, especially the Islamic kind. others have moved on quite a bit, is what shocks me and which creates enormous resentment in me, the degradation of women, and especially the girl child, the brutalization through kidnapping and the trauma and the contempt for the female sex. So it's that kind of thing has been on my mind quite a while. And when I heard about Malala, and I was very delighted that she was given the Peace Prize and so on. Her courage, despite being shot, and really even disfigured for some time, undergo lots of oppression, and still she came out swinging, just like Mandela. And so for me, these are the figures of the future of humanity.
And speaking of courage, one of the things Richard, one of the Jalada people, asked me to ask, and it's something I've thought about myself, is that in some way you have also lived some kind of life of this nature, where sometimes rebellion in the face of big behemoth of government or institutional oppression was the way you chose as a way to respond to society. I speak, of course, of the unknown gunman issue in Ibadan. During the Akintola times, which you covered in Ibadan, the Academic years. So he asked me to ask you that what do you think of the possibility of individual resistance as a way of changing society, as against collective or more institutional response? Sometimes you have no choice, like you have said of your own case, but in the big picture, we have individuals like Malala, like Leah, Sharibu, like Mandela, like yourself. But do you think they're effective, basically?
Well,
or necessary?
You see, people think too much about effectiveness, I think. If all humanity acted, not on impulse, but acted responsibly to situations, I think we'd be in better shape. If you wait until you can have a mass movement, nothing will ever happen. And the two are not mutually exclusive, as you know. I operate on my own, and at the same time, I operate with other people. Yeah. I've started movements before. Some of them are still very much alive, and we can call on them, on members, to react to certain situations. They're not mutually exclusive. The danger for people is to think that any individual act, if it's not immediately effective, therefore is useless. No, that's a gross misconception, and it's also a cop-out, because numbers of situations. Take somebody like Leah. Look at that girl in that moment. She didn't wait to mobilize the others. She didn't, to the best of our knowledge, we were not there. We don't know even if she made an attempt to tell the others, don't convert. We don't know. All we know is that, at least there's a story that she even tried to escape earlier, but failed. And the fact that she tried to escape and failed does not mean one should not attempt to escape a situation like that. No, absolutely not. On the contrary, it's a call, it's a summons to others, say, look, this is what I can do at this moment. You find also something you can do. And that's my attitude to these things. If one waits, first of all, how does one feel waking up in the morning and finding the situation is still the same?
Yeah.
It's just, the issue is being able to live with oneself, being able to enjoy my wine.
Be sure that you've done your own part, leave the rest to others to figure out. Thank you very much, Prof. I think I've asked all the questions I have, and we're very happy that you chose to participate in this project.
It's my pleasure.